The Royal Scots Greys was a cavalry regiment of the British Army from 1707 until 1971, when they amalgamated with the 3rd Carabiniers to form the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. The regiment's history began in 1678, when 3 independent troops of Scots Dragoons were raised. In 1681, these troops were regimented to form the Royal Regiment of Scots Dragoons, numbered the 4th Dragoons in 1694. They were already mounted on grey horses by this stage and were already being referred to as the Grey Dragoons. In 1707, they were renamed the Royal North British Dragoons, but were already being referred to as the Scots Greys. In 1713, they were renumbered the 2nd Dragoons as part of a deal between the establishments of the English Army and Scottish Army when they were being unified into the British Army. They were also sometimes referred to, during the First Jacobite Uprising, as Portmore's Dragoons. In 1877, the nickname was finally made official when they became the 2nd Dragoons, which was inverted in 1921 to the Royal Scots Greys. They kept this title until the 2nd of July 1971, when they amalgamated with the 3rd Carabiniers, forming the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. Origins of the Scots Greys. The Royal Scots Greys originated as 3 troops of dragoons. The first 2 were formed on the 21st of May 1678 under the commands of Captain John Strachan and Captain John Inglis. The third, under the command of Captain Viscount Kingstown, was formed on the 23rd of September 1678. These were the first mounted troops raised for the British Crown in Scotland. Inglis, Strachan and Kingstown's troops would spend their early years suppressing prohibited Presbyterian assemblies in Scotland. In 1681, by royal warrant, these 3 troops were combined, with the addition of 3 further troops, into what would be named the Royal Regiment of Scots Dragoons. Lieutenant General Thomas D.L. would be the regiment's first colonel. In its original configuration, the Scots Greys were configured as a true dragoon regiment. Although mounted, as cavalry regiments were, their armament was closer to that carried by infantry units. Troopers of the Scots Greys were authorized, during the late 17th century, to carry matchlock muskets with bayonets, while the sergeants and corporals carried halberds and pistols. Only the officers were authorized swords, though the lieutenants were to be armed with a partisan. Interestingly, the original uniform called for the troopers to wear grey coats, but there is no record that the regimental mounts had to be of any particular colour. Between its formation in 1681 and 1685, the Scots Greys were employed primarily in keeping civil order in Scotland. The regiment participated in expeditions against various fractious clans which resisted the monarch's rule. In 1688, the regiment was quartered in London at the start of the Glorious Revolution. Upon the landing of William of Orange, the regiment took the side of William and Mary, being taken on into the new King's army. Ordered back to Scotland, the Scots Greys took part in the Battle of Killiecrankie against the Jacobites. For the service, the regiment's title as a Royal Regiment was confirmed and they were ranked as the 4th Dragoons. 1693 to 1714, grey horses, redcoats, and War of Spanish Succession. Prior to 1693, there is no record that the regiment used grey horses exclusive to others. However, when inspected in London in 1693 by King William III, people took note that the regiment was mounted on all grey horses. Some have offered the theory that the grey horses originated with the Dutch Horse Guards. When they left to return to the Netherlands, the horses were turned over to the Scots Scots Greys. Although there is no definite reason, some of the men also wore wide fur caps of broad-brimmed hats. By the time of the royal inspection, uniforms of the regiment had also changed. Gone were the dull grey coats they had initially worn, replaced with the red, or scarlet, coats with blue facings proclaiming the Scots Greys' royal status, together with the Royal English Dragoons and Lord Fairfax's Dragoons. The Scots Greys were transferred to the Netherlands in 1694. There, they saw action during the 9 Years' War, deployed in the traditional dragoon role of reconnaissance and security duties. However, other than a few minor skirmishes on the border with France, the Scots Greys did not see any significant actions during the 3 years on the continent. After returning to Scotland on garrison duties from 1697 to 1702, the Scots Greys were sent to Holland to join the army under John Churchill, soon to become the Duke of Marlborough. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun a year earlier, and the Scots Greys were to take part in his campaigns on the continent. During the first 2 years of the war, Marlborough's forces laid siege to a number of fortresses, including those on the Meuse, the Lower Moselle and Rhine rivers. In the process, capturing Venlo, Roermond, Stevensweert, Liege, Bonwy, and Limburg. Under the command of Thomas Lord Teviot, the Scots Greys would participate in the sieges. For most of the campaigns of 1702 and 1703, the Scots Greys performed the typical cavalry duties of reconnaissance and screening for Marlborough's forces. The first notable action was the capture of a French convoy in 1703, including a large shipment of bullion. The following year, with the Holy Roman Empire threatened by the success of Rákóczi's Hungarian revolt, Marlborough made his march to the Danube. During the campaign, the Scots Greys served as part of Ross's Dragoon Brigade. At the Battle of Schellenberg, on the 2nd of July 1704, the Scots Greys were originally held as part of the reserve. With the failure of the first assault, the Scots Greys were ordered into the line as dismounted infantry. Once the breakthrough occurred, the Scots Greys were back in the saddle, participating in the pursuit. A little more than 2 weeks later, the Scots Greys fought in the Battle of Blenheim. As part of Ross' brigade, the Scots Greys again fought as dismounted infantry in the attack on Blenheim itself. En route to the village, the Scots Greys and the Winds Regiment of Dragoons had to fend off a charge by the French regiments of D'Artois and Provence. With the help of the Hanoverians, the Scots Greys beat back the charge and then helped to clear the French from Blenheim. Despite being heavily engaged, at times in hand-to-hand combat, the Scots Greys did not have a single fatality, though they did suffer many wounded. Following the Battle of Blenheim, the Scots Greys returned to the Netherlands. In 1705, they took part in Marlborough's campaign along the Moselle River. At the Battle of Elixheim, the Scots Greys participated in the massed cavalry charge which broke through the French lines. Although victorious, it was an incomplete victory, as Marlborough had to follow up and complete the defeat of Duc de Villeroy's army. The following year, the Scots Greys were once again in the field under Marlborough. With the French armies pressing the alliance, Marlborough's forces had to remain in the Low Countries. The French armies were maneuvering to fight a battle that would allow them to dictate terms for a peace treaty. The two armies met near Ramillies on the 23rd of May 1706. During the battle, the Scots Greys, serving in Lord Hayes' brigade of dragoons, forced their way into the village of Otter-Église, routing the French infantry defending the village. After passing through the village, the Scots Greys encountered French and quickly defeated the Regiment du Roi. The French quickly surrendered, with the Scots Greys capturing the colours. It was also at this battle that the Scots Greys discovered that one of its troopers was more than he he appeared, carried wounded from the battle to the surgeon. It was discovered that one of the dragoons was in fact a woman who had joined the regiment searching for her husband. The Scots Greys spent the next year on outpost duty. However, in 1708, with the French once again advancing into the Low Countries, the Scots Greys' next significant action would be the Battle of Oudenarde. At the battle, the Scots Greys, now renamed the Royal North British Dragoons, and were held in reserve until the French retreated. The Scots Greys took part in the pursuit until ordered off when it became too dark. The following year, Marlborough's allied army took the offensive against the French. The Scots Greys, still part of Syberg's brigade, took part in the capture of the fortresses Tournai and Ypres. With Marlborough's army heading towards Mons, the French army moved to intercept. After a series of maneuvers, the two armies met at the Battle of Malplaquet on the 11th of September 1709. During the battle, the Scots Greys were brought up from the reserve but found themselves engaged with French cavalry almost as soon as they were ordered forward. After initially being driven back by the French cavalry, the Scots Greys rallied and re-engaged the French. In a series of charges, the Scots Greys steadily drove back the French horse, until finally forcing them to retreat. In the process, the Scots Greys captured the standard of the French household cavalry. 1710 passed with the Scots Greys once again patrolling the frontier with the France. In 1711, the Scots Greys took the field once again with the Duke of Marlborough's army. This time, they helped force Marshal Villars' Ne plus ultra lines defending Paris from the Allied army operating from the Low Countries. As part of the covering force, they participated in the siege of Bouchon. As the Scots Greys were returning home, Britain was in the process of reorganizing the army in the aftermath of the Union of England and Scotland. The British government was trying to make it more uniform, as well as sorting out the question of which regiment took precedence over which. An examination of the records revealed that the designation of the Scots Greys as the 4th Regiment of Dragoons was improper. At the time they entered the service, in 1685, there had been only one other regiment of dragoons in service. However, the senior English Dragoon Regiment was raised after the Scots Greys was first formed. Although this would mean that the Scots Greys should be designated as the 1st Dragoon Regiment, there was a problem. The Royal Scots were already due to be redesignated as the 1st Regiment of Infantry. To blend the English and Scottish military establishments together, a compromise was reached. The English Dragoon Regiment would be designated as the 1st, and the Scots Greys would become the 2nd. Therefore, the Scots Greys were redesignated as the 2nd Royal North British Dragoons. 1715 to 1741 Home Service and Jacobites. Once back in Britain, the Scots Greys returned to Scotland where they helped police the countryside. In 1715, the Earl Mar declared for the Old Pretender, James Stewart, sparking the Jacobite Rising. Remaining loyal to the Anglo-German king, the Scots Greys were active in putting down the uprising. This included taking part at the Battle of Sheriffmuir on the 13th of November 1715. Though the Scots Greys, under the Duke of Argyll, were stationed on the right of the government forces, also known at the time as Portmore's Dragoons, the Scots Greys initially attacked the left flank of the Jacobite army, advancing around a bog, which the Highlanders had thought would protect the flank. The Scots Greys surprised the Highlanders, making repeated charges into disordered ranks of the Jacobite infantry. The Scots Greys continued to pursue the shattered left wing of the Jacobite forces. It fled for nearly 2 miles until it was blocked by the river Allen. Unable to fall back, disorganized, they were easy targets for the Scots Greys Dragoons. It is reported that the Duke of Argyll was said to cry out to spare the poor bluebonnets. However, little quarter was given by Scots Greys to any group trying to rally that day. The rest of the royal forces were not as successful. The Jacobites managed to rout the left wing of the royal army, the day ending in a tactical standoff. Although the fighting was indecisive, the battle had halted the Jacobites' momentum. For the next 4 years, the Scots Greys continued to suppress Jacobite supporters in Scotland, with the final end of the First Jacobite Rising in 1719. The Scots Greys went back to the traditional role, policing Scotland. The next 23 years passed relatively uneventfully for the regiment. War of Austrian Succession in 1742, the Scots Greys were ordered to join the British Army forming on the continent. Initially, they were used to garrison the area around Ghent. Eventually, they joined the main British Army, which was part of the Pragmatic Army, in time for the Battle of Dettingen on the 27th of June 1743. At the start of the battle, the Scots Greys appear to have been stationed, with the majority of the British cavalry, in the front line, most likely on the left flank of the Pragmatic Army. The Scots Greys and other regiments were attacked in the battle by the French Maison du Roi. During the battle, the Scots Greys were described as taking the most pains to be diminished. Despite the seemingly reckless charge, they suffered few casualties during the fight with the French household cavalry, the Maison du Roi cavalry, capturing the standard in the process. The next year was relatively quiet for the Scots Greys. Operating around Brabant and later Ghent, the Scots Greys did not see any action. This changed in 1745 when the Scots Greys took the field with the Duke of Cumberland's forces, part of the Pragmatic Army, as they tried to block the advance of Marshal Saxe. The two forces collided at the Battle of Fontenoy on the 11th of May 1745. Through most of the day, the Scots Greys were held in reserve until the battle turned against the Pragmatic forces. The Scots Greys, together with the Royal Horse Guards and the Black Horse, were ordered to attack the French forces, with the British and Hanoverian forces forced to retreat after the failure of the attack. The Scots Greys helped to cover the retreat. The charge of the British cavalry allowed the army to retire in good order. The defeat at Fontenoy sent reverberations through the British realms. In Scotland, the young Pretender landed in the Highlands and began raising an army to retake the throne. With the start of the Second Jacobite Uprising, the 45, much of the British army which made up the Pragmatic Army was recalled to deal with the Jacobites. The Scots Greys were initially ordered to return with the bulk of the army. However, weather prevented the regiment from sailing, and eventually were ordered to remain in the Low Countries with 3 other regiments of cavalry under the command of Sir John Ligonier. As part of Ligonier's command, the Scots Greys fought at the Battle of Rocou on the 11th of October 1746. Once the French forces began to drive the Allied forces from the positions, the Scots Greys were ordered to cover the retreat. The Scots Greys charged the advancing French infantry, driving them back long enough to allow the Allied forces to retreat in good order. The following year, the Scots Greys once again took the field with the Pragmatic Army. Following the British victory at Culloden, the Duke of Cumberland returned to the continent with 6 brigades and orders to achieve a victory to offset defeats in India. The Scots Greys were brigaded with Rothes Dragoons, Queen's Dragoons, and Duke's Dragoons. The cavalry, commanded again by Ligonier, was posted on the left flank of the British Army at the Battle of Laufeld on the 2nd of July 1747. As the British centre gave way under the French assault, Ligonier realized that the cavalry would have been committed to enable the British forces to retreat. Without orders from Duke of Cumberland, Ligonier led the Scots Greys and the other dragoon regiments in a charge against the French forces. Even though the Scots Greys suffered heavy casualties, the pressure of the French attack was relieved, allowing the rest of Cumberland's forces to retreat from the field. Because of the heavy casualties suffered, the Scots Greys spent the next year being brought up to strength. By the time the regiment neared being brought back up to full strength, the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed. At the conclusion of the peace, the Scots Greys returned to Britain. 7 Years' War. The Scots Greys passed the 7 years between the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle and the start of the 7 Years' War moving from station to station. Within Great Britain, the years passed relatively uneventfully for the regiment. The major development during this period was the addition of a light company to the Scots Greys in 1755. However, soon after the light company was raised, with Britain entering into the 7 Years' War, it was detached from the Scots Greys and combined with the light companies of other cavalry regiments to form a temporary, separate light battalion. This light battalion would be employed raiding the French coast. One of the most notable raids was the attack on St. Malo from the 5th to the 7th of June 1758. The raid resulted in the destruction of the shipping at St. Malo. The balance of the regiment was transferred to Germany, where it joined the army commanded by Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick. Assigned to the cavalry under the command of Lord George Sackville, the Scots Greys arrived in Germany in 1758. The following year, the Scots Greys took part in the Battle of Bergen on the 13th of April 1759. Thereat the forces of Britain, Hanover, Brunswick, and Hesse-Kassel were defeated, leaving the cavalry, including the Scots Greys, to cover the retreat. Because of the rearguard action by the British cavalry, the army was able to survive to fight again later that year near Minden. Reeling after the defeat at Bergen, the British army and its allies reformed and engaged in a series of maneuvers with the French armies. Eventually, the two forces collided on the 1st of August 1759 at the Battle of Minden. The Scots Greys, still part of Sackville's command, were held back due to Sackville's delay. Eventually, while Sackville consulted with his superiors, his deputy, on his own initiative, finally ordered the Scots Greys and the rest of the cavalry forward. However, when Sackville returned, he countermanded the order and the cavalry held its place. Once the battle appeared won, with the French retreating, the Scots Greys and the rest of the cavalry pressed the pursuit of the retreating French army, with Sackville sacked as commander of the British cavalry on the continent and court-martialed for his actions at Minden. The Scots Greys and the rest of the British cavalry came under the command of Marquis of Granby. The following year, 1760, saw the British cavalry more aggressively led at the Battle of Warburg. There, on the 31st of July 1760, the Scots Greys participated in Granby's charge, which broke the French left flank and then defeated the countercharge of the French cavalry. 3 weeks later, the Scots Greys, along with the Inniskilling Dragoons, met with the rearguard of the French forces near the town of Zierenberg. There the Dragoons, supported by some British grenadiers, encountered a French cavalry force covering the retreat. 2 squadrons of the Scots Greys charged 4 squadrons of French cavalry. The Scots Greys and Inniskillings routed the French, sending them in a disorderly retreat into the town of Zierenberg. Soon after, infantry was brought up to storm the town. The town and the survivors of the Scots Greys attack were captured. The Scots Greys began the following year by conducting patrols and skirmishing with French troops. Eventually, the Scots Greys were with the main army under Brunswick at the Battle of Villinghausen on 16 July 1761. The start of 1762 found the Scots Greys again raiding and clashing with French cavalry along the Hanoverian frontier. With the war approaching the end, the French decided to make one last concerted effort to overrun Hanover. At the same time, Brunswick, still commanding the Anglo-Hanoverian Brunswick-Hessian forces in western Germany, wanted to take the initiative once the campaign season arrived. The two forces met at the castle of Wilhelmsthal near Calden. Still attached to Granby's command, the Scots Greys were present for the Battle of Wilhelmsthal on the 24th of July 1762. As the French centre gave way, the Scots Greys were ordered to exploit the victory. The Scots Greys drove the French forces through the village of Wilhelmsthal, capturing many prisoners and part of the baggage train. The Battle of Wilhelmsthal was to be the Scots Greys' last major engagement of the war. The following year, the French and British concluded the Treaty of Paris, ending the hostilities, for the moment, between the two. With the end of the fighting, the Scots Greys returned home to Great Britain via the Low Countries.